In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But what if I told you that there's a deeper, hidden version of that creation story, one that's been carefully veiled from the world for centuries? What if the Genesis you've always known, with its poetic beauty and broad strokes, is just the surface of something far more intricate, far more profound? This isn't just another ancient text. It's a divine map, a sacred blueprint that charts not just creation, but the entire history of mankind in cycles of time, cycles that were deliberately concealed. The Book of Jubilees, a sacred text once revered by the Essenes and echoed by early church fathers, offers a completely different lens through which to view the story of Adam and Eve, Noah, and even the cosmic battle behind the veil of human history. Why was this book excluded from the Bible? Was it too dangerous to be shared with the world? Or did it reveal too much? An order of creation, a divine law, and a battle between good and evil that we've never truly understood. In this video, you will uncover the untold story of the Book of Jubilees and how it completely changes our understanding of Genesis. Together, we will explore the spiritual war that began not at Sinai, but at the dawn of time, and how this sacred text could transform the way we view God's law, grace, and our place in history. You will see how Adam and Eve's fall wasn't an accident, but part of a much larger cosmic conflict. You'll learn about the law that predates Moses, about how the patriarchs like Abraham were not just men of faith, but keepers of divine ordinances. This isn't just a retelling of old stories, it's a revelation of the divine rhythm that governs creation. It's about rediscovering a forgotten inheritance that has been hidden in plain sight for millennia. As you journey through this hidden history, ask yourself, how would our faith change if we understood this fuller, deeper version of God's plan? Let us dive into the truth that's been waiting to be uncovered. In the Book of Jubilees, time is not merely a linear progression, but a divine rhythm, a cyclical unfolding of God's eternal plan. Every moment, every event is not accidental, but purposeful, placed exactly where it should be in God's sacred calendar. The concept of time in Jubilees is structured, precise, and ordered, painting a picture of a cosmic dance in which every act of creation, every decision made, reverberates throughout eternity. In Genesis, we see events happen. Adam and Eve are created, the fall occurs, and Noah builds the ark. But we are left without the deeper understanding of when and why these events occur as they do. The Book of Jubilees reveals this sacred timeline. The fall of man, for instance, is not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger, meticulously planned series of events in God's divine design. In Genesis, Adam and Eve are created, and soon after, they fall from grace. But in Jubilees, this moment of disobedience occurs after 7 full years of harmony and divine instruction. For 7 years, Adam and Eve lived in perfect peace, in covenant with God. There was no sin, no rebellion. They were given guidance, wisdom, and understanding, an idyllic life. And yet, on the 8th year, on the 14th day of the 2nd month, everything changed. This was not a random fall. It was a moment written into the very fabric of time, a predetermined act within a divine plan. The fall of Adam and Eve was not a failure of creation. It was a pivotal moment in God's unfolding story, a story that would ultimately lead to redemption. We often read Genesis and wonder why it happened. Why did humanity fall, despite being created in such a perfect state? But the Book of Jubilees answers that question with clarity. Time was designed to unfold in cycles, and each cycle had its purpose. Just as God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th, every act in humanity's history occurs at the appointed time. The fall wasn't an accident. It was part of a cosmic drama. Even our mistakes, our transgressions, are woven into this divine rhythm. But here's the beautiful truth. God's redemption plan was also there from the beginning. The fall may have disrupted the harmony of Eden, but it didn't destroy the divine purpose. Instead, it set the stage for God's grace to shine through. The idea of time as a sacred cycle invites us to reflect on our own lives. How often do we feel as if we're stuck in a linear, unchanging path? How often do we believe that our mistakes, our setbacks, and our failures define us, that we cannot rise again? But if we look at our lives through the lens of sacred cycles, we see that every mistake, every setback, every challenge is part of a divine rhythm, a rhythm that always leads us back to grace. We are not condemned to live in the past. We are called to rise again, to renew ourselves, and to align ourselves with the eternal patterns laid out by God. Time is not something that controls us. We are part of God's divine story, and we have a role to play in His great symphony. This understanding of time leads us to the realization that God's law was not introduced suddenly at Sinai. It was always present, even from the very beginning. In the Book of Jubilees, we learn that the patriarchs, Adam, Seth, Enoch, Noah, and even Abraham, were not just men of faith, but were also keepers of God's law. This divine law was not something newly revealed to Moses. Instead, it was embedded in creation, woven into the very fabric of the universe. From the beginning, humanity was given the law of God to guide them, to help them live in harmony with the divine order. The patriarchs were not living by a new set of rules. They were living in remembrance of the eternal law that had been passed down from Adam. Imagine the implications of this. We are often taught that God's law began with Moses, that it was something unique to the nation of Israel. But Jubilees paints a different picture, a picture where God's law was not a new invention, but a timeless truth. Adam knew the law. Seth knew the law. Enoch, the righteous one who walked with God, knew the law. And Noah, after the flood, offered sacrifices not out of instinct, but because he was following the divine ordinances that had been passed down through the generations. These men were not pioneers of faith in the way we think of them. They were custodians of divine truth, protectors of God's law, long before Moses ever stood on Mount Sinai. What does this mean for us today? We often separate law and grace, thinking of them as opposites. But what if grace was never meant to replace the law? What if grace and law were always meant to work together, as eternal partners? What if, from the very beginning, God's grace was always available to us, not as a reaction to our mistakes, but as a constant companion to the law? The law was never meant to be a burden. It was meant to guide us back to the divine rhythm, to lead us back to the perfect harmony we lost in Eden. And grace, far from being something that was introduced to fix our mistakes, was always there, waiting for us to turn back to God. This understanding of grace changes everything. It shows us that we are not simply lost, wandering in a chaotic world. We are part of a divine story, a story that has been unfolding since the beginning of time. And just as the patriarchs lived according to the eternal law, we too are called to live according to the rhythms of God's creation. We are not condemned by our mistakes. We are invited to return to the law, to remember the divine patterns that guide us. Just as Adam, Seth, and Noah remembered the law, we too are called to remember the divine truth that was revealed to them. But the Book of Jubilees doesn't just reveal the law, it also uncovers a deeper truth about the spiritual battle that began long before humanity was created. We are taught in Genesis that Satan, the deceiver, entered the Garden of Eden and tempted Eve to sin. But in Jubilees, we learn that this was not the first time Satan had intervened in God's plan. Mastema, as he is called in Jubilees, is not just a serpent or a symbol of evil. He is a deliberate actor in the divine narrative, a being who has been working against God's plan since the very beginning. In Jubilees, Satan's role in the fall of man is not accidental. He was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew the divine law, and he knew how to corrupt it. He didn't tempt Eve on a whim. He was part of a much larger cosmic struggle, one that began long before Eden and continues to this day. This spiritual warfare is not something distant or irrelevant. It is part of the fabric of our lives. We are all participants in this cosmic battle, and the choices we make, the ways we live, are part of the divine rhythm that plays out in the world. As we reflect on this, we must ask ourselves, what role are we playing in this spiritual battle? Are we living in alignment with God's law? Or are we, like Adam and Eve, allowing ourselves to be deceived by the temptations of this world? The Book of Jubilees calls us to remember the divine law, to live in harmony with the rhythms of creation, and to understand that we are not passive observers in this spiritual battle. We are active participants, and our choices matter. As we move forward in this story, we must remember that just as time is cyclical, so too is the opportunity for redemption. The divine rhythms that we have lost can be restored. Just as the patriarchs lived according to the law, we too can return to that sacred order. And just as grace has always been available to humanity, it is available to us today. We are not defined by our failures. We are defined by the divine story in which we are participants. Let us embrace this truth. Let us live according to the divine rhythm, and let us remember the sacred law that has been with us since the beginning of time. In this journey, we will find not just redemption, but a deeper understanding of God's eternal plan, a plan that has been unfolding from the very beginning, a plan that will continue to unfold until the very end of time. In the Book of Jubilees, we find a deeper understanding of the fall of man, a fall that wasn't merely an accident or a single moment of disobedience, but part of a cosmic battle that had been brewing long before Adam and Eve ever walked in the Garden of Eden. The fall, as we know it, is a pivotal moment in the Bible, but the Book of Jubilees reveals a far more intricate picture. Adam and Eve were created to live in perfect harmony with God, yet something occurred, a rupture in that harmony, a break in the divine order. But this fall was not a simple act of defiance. It was a carefully orchestrated rebellion, one that was part of a grand cosmic war. The serpent in Genesis is often seen as a mere tempter, but in Jubilees, we learn that it was not just the serpent who played a role in this great deception. Behind the serpent lay Mastema, the embodiment of evil, and his presence in the garden was not a random event. This is where the cosmic battle begins to take shape, not on the battlefield, not in a physical realm, but in the realm of spiritual warfare. Mastema, or Satan, as he is known in other texts, had been observing the creation, watching as God formed man and woman in his image. And when the time was right, when Adam and Eve were living in perfect peace, he struck. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was a calculated attack on the divine order. He didn't just deceive Eve with words. He sought to destroy the very fabric of what God had made. And when Eve partook of the forbidden fruit and shared it with Adam, the fall was not just a moral failure. It was a cosmic shift. It was the moment when humanity took a step away from the divine law that had been embedded in creation from the very beginning. The fall was not merely about eating fruit. It was about choosing to break covenant with God, to break the sacred rhythm of the universe. This spiritual warfare, as described in Jubilees, invites us to look beyond the obvious and see that our choices, our decisions, are never just personal. They are part of a much larger story. The choices we make ripple out into the world, affecting not only our own lives, but the very fabric of creation. Every act of rebellion against God, every moment of sin, is part of the ongoing battle between good and evil, between the divine and the rebellious forces that seek to distort creation. When we understand this, we begin to see that our lives are not just random occurrences, they are moments in the grand story of God's creation, and our choices matter deeply. The great tragedy of the fall is not just that Adam and Eve disobeyed God. It is that they chose to listen to the lies of Mastema, to the voice that sought to distort the truth and lead them away from the divine law. The fall, as devastating as it was not the end of the story. In fact, it was the beginning of the long road back to restoration. But how could humanity return to the peace of Eden? How could we undo the damage done by that first act of rebellion? This is where the message of grace enters the story. The grace of God was not a reaction to the fall. It was always present, always waiting to be revealed. God had a plan from the beginning, a plan to restore what was lost, to heal the breach, and to bring creation back into harmony with Him. But God's grace does not operate in a vacuum. It works in tandem with His law, and this is one of the most profound lessons we learn from the Book of Jubilees. The law was not something new that God introduced with Moses. It was there from the beginning. Adam, Noah, and Abraham were all given divine instructions to follow. They were not just faith figures, but law-keepers, guardians of the divine ordinances. The law wasn't something arbitrary that God imposed on His people. It was a reflection of the very structure of creation itself. The law was woven into the fabric of reality, a guiding force that directed creation toward its intended purpose. In the Book of Jubilees, we see that the Patriarchs understood this law. Adam kept the Sabbath, Seth followed divine ordinances, and Enoch, the great righteous man, walked with God, living in perfect alignment with His will. These men were not perfect, but they understood that the law was not a burden. It was a gift, a way to live in harmony with God and with creation. They understood that the law was not just about rules, it was about relationship. It was about living in accordance with the divine rhythm that governed the universe. And this law, long before Moses, was passed down through the generations, from Adam to Noah, from Noah to Abraham. But what does this mean for us today? How do we relate to the law, and how does it connect to the message of grace? We often think of grace and law as opposing forces, but in the Book of Jubilees we see that they are not opposites, they are partners. Grace does not replace the law, it fulfills it. Grace is not a response to our failure. It is the invitation to live in alignment with the law, to walk in the divine rhythm that was set in motion from the beginning of creation. Grace enables us to do what we could not do on our own. It empowers us to live in harmony with God, to keep the divine law, and to restore the relationship that was broken in Eden. This partnership between law and grace is key to understanding the message of the Book of Jubilees. It teaches us that God's plan for humanity has always been one of restoration. From the very beginning, He intended for us to live in harmony with His law. When we stray from that law, we fall into chaos, into rebellion, and into spiritual death. But when we return to the law, when we align our lives with the divine rhythm, we experience life and peace. And this is where grace comes in. It enables us to return to the law, to return to the divine order, and to experience the healing that comes from living in alignment with God's will. We see this in the life of Abraham, who is often remembered as the father of faith. But Abraham was not just a man of faith. He was a man of obedience. He lived according to the divine law, long before it was codified at Sinai. He knew the law of God, and he followed it with precision. He kept the Sabbath, offered sacrifices, and followed the commandments that had been passed down through the generations. Abraham was not just a man who believed in God. He was a man who obeyed God, who lived in accordance with His law. And in doing so, he became a model for us, a model of how to live in harmony with God's will, a model of how grace and law work together to bring restoration and healing. As we reflect on the story of Abraham, we must ask ourselves, are we living in obedience to the divine law? Are we following the rhythms of creation, or are we living out of sync with God's will? The law is not just a set of rules, it is a reflection of God's heart, and grace is not just a free pass, it is the power to live in accordance with God's heart. When we understand this, we begin to see that our lives are part of a much larger story, a story that stretches back to the beginning of creation and forward to the fulfillment of all things. And just as Abraham's faith was a response to God's law, so too must our faith be a response that leads us to live in harmony with God's will, to walk in the divine rhythm, and to experience the restoration that He has promised. In the Book of Jubilees, we see that the law is not something that was introduced suddenly at Sinai. It was always there, embedded in creation, woven into the fabric of reality. And grace was not something that came after the fall. It was always available, always waiting for us to return to it. Just as Adam, Noah, and Abraham lived by the law, we too are called to live by it. And just as grace was there to help them live in accordance with God's will, it is available to us today. The law and grace are not separate. They are part of the same divine plan, a plan that was set in motion at the beginning of creation and will continue to unfold until the end of time. So, as we reflect on the story of Adam, Eve, Noah, and Abraham, let us remember that our lives are part of this divine story. Let us align ourselves with the law, let us receive God's grace, and let us live in harmony with the divine rhythm. This is the story that the Book of Jubilees invites us to enter, a story of redemption, restoration, and healing. A story that has been unfolding from the beginning and will continue to unfold until the very end. And in this story, we find not just our purpose, but our true identity as children of God, created to live in His image, to walk in His ways, and to participate in His eternal plan. As we move deeper into the story, it becomes clear that the Book of Jubilees is not just about revealing the law or exposing the cosmic battles that shape human history. It's about the divine orchestration of time itself. Every cycle, every season, is part of a grander, more intricate plan, a plan woven into the very fabric of creation. The story of humanity, from the first moment of creation to the final restoration, is a divine symphony, and we are all playing our part. The question must be asked, why was the Book of Jubilees hidden from the canon of Scripture? Why, after centuries of reverence and quotation, did it suddenly vanish from the sacred texts? Was it because the Church, or even the powers of the time, feared the implications of what it revealed? The answer may lie not in the nature of the content, but in the uncomfortable truth that it presents. The Book of Jubilees challenges us to rethink the very way we view creation, the law, and even salvation. It reminds us that the law of God is eternal, embedded in the very structure of the universe, and was given to humanity long before the Mosaic covenant. It unveils the complexity of the cosmic battle that has been waged since the beginning of time, a battle that continues to affect us all today. For many, the idea that divine law existed before Moses is a difficult concept to accept. It challenges the narrative that the law was a new creation, introduced at Sinai. But in Jubilees, we see something entirely different, a law that was always there, present from the very beginning, passed down through the Patriarchs, and lived out by the righteous men and women who preceded Moses. This law was not just a set of rules or commands. It was the very way in which the universe was designed to function. It was the divine rhythm that governed all creation, and those who lived in accordance with it, like Adam, Enoch, Noah, and Abraham experienced peace and alignment with God's will. We often separate law and grace, thinking of them as opposing forces, law as rigid, unyielding, and grace as compassionate, forgiving, and free. But the Book of Jubilees calls us to see the law as the very foundation of grace. It shows us that grace was never a new concept. It has always been present, working alongside the law. The law is not something that restricts us, but something that sets us free. It is not a burden, but a gift, a way for us to live in harmony with the divine will, to experience the fullness of life as God intended. And grace, far from being something that rescues us from the law, is the power that enables us to live by the law, to fulfill its righteous requirements, and to restore the broken relationship between humanity and God. As we reflect on the patriarchs, on Adam, Enoch, Noah, and Abraham, we see that their lives were not just examples of faith. They were examples of obedience to God's eternal law. Adam, the first man, was given the law, and he kept it. He knew the Sabbath and kept it holy. He offered sacrifices, acknowledging the divine order that had been established from the beginning. And when Noah emerged from the flood, the first thing he did was offer a sacrifice, renewing the covenant with God. This was not a reaction to the flood. It was a fulfillment of the eternal law, a restoration of the divine rhythm that had been disrupted by sin. But perhaps the most powerful example of the relationship between law and grace is found in the life of Abraham. Abraham is often celebrated as the father of faith, the man who believed in God's promises. But in Jubilees, we see that Abraham was also a man who lived by the law. He did not simply trust in God's promises. He lived in obedience to God's commands. He kept the commandments that had been passed down from Adam and Noah. He knew the laws of purity, the laws of sacrifice, the laws of the Sabbath, and he obeyed them. Abraham's faith was not a blind trust in God's promises. It was a trust that was rooted in his understanding of the divine law, a trust that led him to live in alignment with God's will. And it was because of this obedience that Abraham was called righteous. He didn't earn God's favor through his works, but his works were the evidence of his faith, the fruit of a life lived in harmony with the divine will. This is a profound lesson for us today. We often view the law as something burdensome, something that stands in the way of our freedom. We see grace as something that frees us from the law, that allows us to live without restrictions. But the Book of Jubilees calls us to see the law as a gift, a way for us to align our lives with God's perfect design. The law does not restrict us. It frees us. It sets us on the path of righteousness, peace, and joy. And grace is not something that allows us to live in rebellion to God's will. It is the power that enables us to live according to that will, to fulfill the law, and to experience the blessings that come from living in harmony with God. As we continue to explore the story of the patriarchs and the unfolding of God's eternal plan, we come to the realization that the story of redemption is not just a story of individual salvation. It is the story of the restoration of creation itself. The fall of Adam and Eve was not just the fall of humanity. It was the fall of the entire cosmos. The rebellion of humanity disrupted the divine order, bringing chaos and death into a world that was created for life and harmony. But God's plan has always been to restore that order, to bring creation back into alignment with his perfect will. And the Book of Jubilees reveals that this plan began long before the flood, long before Moses, and long before the birth of Jesus. The law, the covenant, and the promise of redemption were all part of the divine rhythm that has been unfolding since the beginning. This is the story that we are invited to enter, a story that begins with creation and ends with restoration. The Book of Jubilees doesn't just give us more information, it gives us a new lens through which to view the world. It reveals that the law is not something that was introduced at Sinai, but something that was embedded in creation from the very beginning. It shows us that grace is not a response to our failure, but the power that enables us to live in harmony with the divine will. And it invites us to participate in the divine rhythm, to align our lives with God's eternal plan, and to experience the fullness of life that He has promised. But the story doesn't end with the patriarchs. As we move forward in the narrative, we are introduced to the Watchers, the fallen angels who played a significant role in the corruption of humanity. In the Book of Jubilees, we see that the fall of humanity was not just the result of human disobedience, it was also the result of angelic rebellion. The Watchers, beings who were once entrusted with the care of creation, chose to abandon their post and descend to earth, where they corrupted humanity with forbidden knowledge. This was not just a moral failure, it was a cosmic betrayal. The Watchers sought to disrupt God's plan, to sow chaos in creation, and to lead humanity astray. And their actions had profound consequences, not only for humanity, but for the entire world. The Nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers, were giants who wreaked havoc on the earth, bringing violence and corruption wherever they went. This is where the story takes a dark turn. The rebellion of the Watchers, their fall from grace, and the rise of the Nephilim all point to the reality of spiritual warfare, a warfare that is not just a matter of human sin, but a battle that stretches beyond our understanding. It is a battle between the forces of good and evil, between God's plan for creation and the forces that seek to distort it. But even in the midst of this cosmic struggle, God's plan of redemption remains unchanged. Just as He called Noah to restore order after the flood, He calls us to stand firm in the face of spiritual warfare, to align our lives with His law, and to trust in His grace. The Book of Jubilees teaches us that we are not passive observers in this battle. We are active participants. The choices we make, the way we live, the way we respond to God's law and grace, all of these things matter. They are part of the divine rhythm, part of the larger story that God is telling. And as we align ourselves with that story, we can be part of the restoration, part of the redemption, part of the divine plan that is unfolding in the world. This is not just a story of salvation, it is a story of cosmic renewal, of the restoration of all things, and we are called to be a part of it. As we bring this journey to a close, I want to invite you to pause and reflect on the incredible truth that the Book of Jubilees reveals, a truth that transcends time and space. The stories we've explored together, from the cosmic battle that began before the foundation of the world, to the divine law that has been embedded in creation since the dawn of time, are not just ancient accounts. They are a living, breathing reminder of the divine rhythm that pulses through all things, a rhythm that calls us to align ourselves with the Creator's will. In a world that often feels chaotic and fragmented, it's easy to lose sight of the divine order that underlies everything. We are bombarded with distractions, pressures, and challenges that pull us away from the peace and harmony we were created for. But the Book of Jubilees offers us a powerful reminder. Time is not random. It is sacred. Our lives are not accidents. They are part of a grand divine story that is unfolding before our eyes. And just as the patriarchs, Adam, Noah, Abraham, found their way by living in alignment with God's law, so too can we. Imagine for a moment the peace that comes from knowing that we are not adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Imagine the comfort of understanding that every season of our lives is part of a divine rhythm, a cycle that has been set in motion since the very beginning. The fall of humanity, the rebellion of the Watchers, the covenant made with Noah, the promises given to Abraham, They are all part of a larger story, a story that has been written for us, for all of humanity and for the whole of creation. And this story is not over. The divine plan is still unfolding, and we are invited to be a part of it. As we reflect on the lives of the patriarchs and the eternal law that guided them, we are reminded that God's grace is not a new idea introduced after the fall. Grace has always been with us, available to us, to help us live according to God's perfect design. It is not a reaction to our failures. It is the divine power that enables us to return to the divine rhythm, to align our lives with God's will. Just as grace empowered the patriarchs to live according to the law, it empowers us today to live in harmony with God's eternal plan. This is not just a theological idea. It is a practical, transformative truth that can change the way we live. But here's the thing. This journey isn't just about learning ancient truths. It's about applying them in our daily lives. It's about recognizing that the same divine law that governed creation and guided the patriarchs is available to us today. We don't have to live in the chaos and confusion of this world. We can choose to align ourselves with the divine rhythm, to live in harmony with God's will, and to experience the peace and fulfillment that comes from walking in His ways. And this is where you come in. If this video has touched your heart, if it has brought you closer to understanding the divine rhythm that governs your life, I invite you to support this journey. Your presence, your engagement, your comments, they all help spread this message to others who need to hear it. If you feel that this video has added value to your soul, if it has helped you find light in the darkness, I humbly ask you to show your support by liking, subscribing, and sharing. Every small act of support is a precious gift, and it empowers me to continue creating videos that share the truth of God's Word with the world. I want to thank you from the depths of my heart for being a part of this journey. Your encouragement and support mean more than words can express. This is not just a one-way conversation. It's a partnership, a community that seeks to grow together in understanding and faith. As we continue to explore the depths of Scripture, as we continue to walk this path together, I believe we will uncover even greater truths that will transform our lives and bring us closer to God. So, if you feel the call, if you feel that this message resonates with you, please share it with others who may need to hear it. Comment below with your thoughts, your questions, and your insights. I would love to hear how this message has impacted you and what you're learning as we all strive to live in alignment with God's eternal law. Together, we are part of a greater story, a story that has been unfolding since the beginning of time, a story that will continue until the end of days. And it's a story that we are invited to live, to participate in, and to share with the world. Thank you once again, from the bottom of my heart, for your support and for being a part of this community. May you continue to walk in the divine rhythm. May you continue to experience the grace and peace that come from living in harmony with God's will. And may you continue to find strength, hope, and light in His Word.